I'll be brief in my introductions. We have 3 speakers. Many of you know Jeff Halper as one of the founders and directors of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's, in Edward Said's terms, a public intellectual and a compassionate activist who's just done terrific work, both in terms of his analysis of the situation in Israel-Palestine, as well as his real feel for individual people, and that comes through very much in all of your work. So he's again, we'll have more of a fundraising little speech after all of this, but I encourage all of you to donate what you can to the organization that he's so involved with. So a couple years ago, he has spoken in Toronto several times, and in those talks that range over a period of maybe 4 to 6 years, I can't remember exactly, he spoke very specifically about focusing on Israel's military as being very, very important, an aspect of reframing how we think about Israel, not as a victim and not as the only democracy and so on in the Middle East, but as a very powerful military power, and that it's so important to reframe that understanding, and it is actually never really taken off as being a focus, at least as far as I can see, in many of the groups who work for Palestinian rights and so on. So I know Jeff is just completing a book now about that, and that will be the focus of his talk this evening. It's also, fortunately, has become a focus of the Independent Jewish Voices campaign now, the global pacification system, and how Canada and Israel are very involved and complicit in that system. So I encourage you to look at the IJV website. There's a sign-up too in the back if you want to be on the listserv about that. The focus tonight will also be on the global situation, both in terms of Canada and Israel. And one of the things that I've thought about in terms of the difficulty of this topic is that it not only involves the reframing of Israel, but also the reframing of Canada, as peacekeeper and so on and so forth. And looking much more carefully at what Canada's role is in the world. And there's so many examples of that. I'll just mention one, that is very pertinent to the subject, is that in the last few months, Canada was one of 6 nations at the UN that opposed a resolution asking Israel to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's another elephant in the room, which is nuclear weapons, and Israel's, that's is almost a taboo subject even amongst the organizations that are opposed to nuclear weapons. So I told you a little bit about Jeff. The other speakers tonight are Greg Albo, who teaches political economy in the Department of Political Sciences at York University. He's the co-editor of A Different Kind of State, Popular Power, and Democratic Administration. And he's authored numerous articles in journals such as Studies in Political Economy, The Socialist Register, Canadian Dimension, and Monthly Review. He's also on the executive of the Center for Social Justice here in Toronto. And I have the latest Canadian Dimension magazine on the back table, and it has a terrific article by Greg. The other speaker is, as a discussant, is Robert Latham. He teaches in the Department of Political Science, also at York University in Toronto. His interests include the technologies of border surveillance, critical theories of sovereignty, transnational relations, migration, human security, and global governance. He's interested in collective action, human rights, and international law, Israel, Palestine, Africa, North America, and the Arctic. So what we're going to have tonight is Jeff's going to speak first, then Greg, and then Robert Latham will be a discussant. And the purpose of this is really to go beyond what I think many of us already know quite a bit about, to really think deeply about how things need to change and how we can understand the global institutional side of this, these problems too. So with that, I introduce Jeff.
I'm on a month-long, I'm getting a little bit old for this line of work, but a month-long tour that's going to take me from St. John's to Victoria Island in January. Great planning. And I'll either be stronger or pass this on to the next generation. At any rate, this is a great opportunity for me because I don't have to start with Occupation 101 with you guys, and we can really begin to start kind of develop the ideas of where Palestine is leading us, and also the fact that Judy and Robert and Greg are here is really important for me, because one of the problems of being an activist, I mean, public intellectual is very nice too, that's a nice title, or an activist scholar is another way of putting it. The problem with activist scholars, I'm an anthropologist, and I left the university, I don't know, 15, 16 years ago, when we started our committee, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, because I found, personally, I couldn't do both. They're both full, I wanted to be serious, they were both full-time. Especially because when we deal with the house demolition issue, we really have to be there for the Palestinians. Somebody calls you at 5:30 in the morning and says the bulldozers are on their way to demolish my home. You can't say, geez, I got a class today, call me back tomorrow. I mean, you either have to be there or not. I didn't have any control. I lost control over my own agenda. I mean, I had to be responsive to whatever the occupation set my daily agenda, more or less. And so I decided to leave the university to do this full-time work. I'm not so sure if it was the best decision, but it was a decision I made. And one of the problems of activist scholars is the lack of institutional support. I mean, the fact, obviously, that I have to go past the hat for you guys says something, but also, you tend to work in isolation. I don't have colleagues. My colleagues are activists, but the activists are on the barricades. A lot of them are young. They're not academics. And so very much what I'm trying to do is to bridge that. On the one hand, to be an activist and to be there on the ground and so on, but at the same time to bring an analysis to our activism, because in my view we have to be actors. I don't want to just be an activist, just a resistor, just a protester. I think we have to be an actor in terms of formulating solutions, formulating end games to our struggles, and in trying to effectively organize and strategize and in fact impact on policy, impact on what's happening. And we can't do that without analysis. So on the one hand, I found a certain disconnect, that the activists don't have the analysis, many of them, because they're not academics, and they're on the barricades. Many of them are academics, but they're not academics in the area that they're doing activism in. But they don't have the support of academics in those fields because the academics are at the university. And the academics at the university do very important work, and they have the concepts and they have the tools and so on, but they're not on the ground. And so the questions that we ask, our questions as activists, aren't necessarily the questions that academics at the universities are addressing. So there's a whole disconnect there. One of the things I'm trying to work on to found is what I call an Institute of Strategic Activism. Something that will bring together academics and activists in much more of a working relationship in order to deal with these things. So I've always seen that as part of my role, is to be that bridge. I have those academic skills, but I'm also on the ground. And I think that's one of the things that has really made ICAD, my organization, effective. And that is that we're there, you know, I can get in front of bulldozers. That's why I'm built this way. You know. But at the same time, I can read what's going on. Why are they bulldozing this house? Is there a pattern to demolishing homes? Why are they demolishing homes? Who's doing it? And in the end, what are Israel's intentions? And then it's literally a grounded analysis. I mean, it's grounded, it's so grounded that your hands are dirty. You know, that leads us to our analysis, which I think makes it not authoritative, but gives it a lot of strength. So over the years, of course, fighting the occupation and this and that, but it's always kind of nagged me. Kind of the question, you know, why doesn't Israel go along with the two-state solution? Why doesn't Israel give up the occupation? I mean, the whole occupation is 22% of the country. It's not a very important part of the country in many ways. Israel's had innumerable opportunities to make peace that are on their own terms. I mean, even the two-state solution leaves Israel on 78% of the country. And as a matter of fact, the Palestinians would even compromise on that. It doesn't really make sense, especially if you go back to the Oslo process, where the settlers and the right wing weren't that strong. I mean, don't forget, Rabin had a government that was the Labour Party in Meretz. And that's all they had. They didn't need the religious parties, the Likud, the right wing, and they still didn't go there. And so I began to sort of, as it's been gelling in my head, I begun to see the occupation more as a resource, the occupied territories, more as a resource that Israel has, rather than seeing it as a part of the land of Israel, seeing it in an ideological sense, a security sense, in a much wider way. If you think about it, the occupation is kind of a laboratory where Israel can test and develop weapons. You know, it's a battle space that's very valuable. But at the same time, it's the military is what gives Israel the status that it has. If we think about it, if Israel didn't have the occupation, and if it had peace, it would be New Zealand. You know, it'd be some little country somewhere. I mean, New Zealand in a nice way. This is nothing against New Zealand. In other words, it would be a nice country that would be very nice to live with, but it wouldn't be a strategic ally of the United States. It wouldn't be the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. It wouldn't be an associate of NATO, participating in NATO exercises. It wouldn't be those sorts of things. So the fact is, in a way, that the occupation becomes very important to maintain Israel's place at the table with the big boys. And I think if you see it in that sense, the occupation is a resource that lets Israel develop and test weapons. That's very important in terms of its economy, of course, but even more so in terms of its what I call security politics. Security politics is what, the way I define it, is when a country parties its military prowess into political clout. So that here's Israel, this little country, but because of its military prowess that it acquires through 100 years of conflict with the Palestinians and the wider Arab world, it has models, it has technologies, it has abilities to to really be a leader in what I call the global pacification system. And that's what I've been trying to write about global Palestine. The idea is that the Palestinians, I mean, you can't explain, for example, the assault on Gaza this last summer in a military way. The use of force was so disproportionate to any existential threat that these few rockets of Hamas had. In other words, it wasn't a military kind of a thing. There was something else going on. And I think that something else was, again, the testing of weapons, the testing of certain kinds of tactics, and in a sense, giving Israeli weaponry an edge in the market because it's combat proven. So it seemed to me that the Palestinians weren't the point. The Palestinians were simply the guinea pigs. I mean, they weren't an existential threat to Israel. They weren't, the Palestinians in some ways were irrelevant. But they were a convenient, like I say, a convenient guinea pig in a laboratory. But the end users are really you people much more. In other words, the countries of the world, not just the rich countries, but all the countries of the world that are buying Israeli technologies, Israeli arms, Israeli tactics, Israeli training for export. So that it began to get me thinking about what I call global Palestine. And in a way, what Israel is trying to do with the Palestinians, which is a kind of pacification, is what the system, what I call a global pacification system. And in fact, this is a concept that is coming into use more and more. There's a, in the whole area of military studies, there's a field called security studies. I'm sure you have it here in the Canadian University, security studies, which is like realpolitik sort of stuff, militaries and security. And then there's another field that's called critical security studies, which maybe the last 15 or 20 years, especially coming out of Copenhagen, it brings in a more of a critical kind of a neo-Marxist view of militarism, but it's still fairly mainstream. Now there's another whole project, as it's called, that's developing, and it's developing out of Canada to a certain degree, especially out of Carleton University in Ottawa, that's called the Anti-Security Project. And they're saying, one of the leaders, I don't know if he's known, is George Rigakos, who's a professor of, this is a whole, I'm discovering fields I never knew existed. He's a professor of critical police science. Whoa, that's very interesting. I'm discovering a whole world of the military and police and security that I never knew existed. And I think it's really important that we in the left begin to realize that this world exists and try to bring it onto our agenda much more. So that school is called the Anti-Security Project. And they're saying we shouldn't be using the word security at all because we're buying into the system. We're buying, when you say security for people, that's a good thing. I mean, who doesn't want security? And we're being protected and so on. But they say, and what they're trying to do is reappropriate the term pacification that has not been used very much in the social sciences. Pacification has always been used in a very precise way of the First Nations. You pacified villages in Vietnam, in that kind of a sense, but they're trying to reappropriate it in a more general way and to say that, in fact, we're all being pacified in the capitalist world system. They want to make us consumers. They don't want, you can't resist. If you resist, you're a terrorist. And this whole language of terrorism and security that's become so pervasive really has to do with pacifying us. If possible in a nice way, by manufacturing consent. So we go into the airport and voluntarily take off our shoes. And if not, then in not so nice ways. Hegemony can be certainly enforced. And so the idea of pacification is if we start to use the word pacification, a whole different set of questions emerges. You know, who wants to be pacified? I want to be secure. I don't want to be pacified. And who's pacifying me? And why are they pacifying me? And how are they pacifying me? In other words, a whole set of critical questions emerge when you change that language from security to pacification that I think is really crucial for our critical approach to the world. So basically what I'm trying to do is take my research and put it within what's called world systems analysis. Many of you know Emanuel Wallerstein and the whole school of world, which is sort of a neo-Marxist, but I found it the most useful approach for me, in which I think we have to put why they're pacifying us and how within this modern world systems theory. I'm not going to get into it, but the whole idea of a hegemony of transnational capital is really the name of the game, in a sense.
What does hegemony mean?
Hegemony? Well, and hegemony, I find, and it's a word that isn't commonly used, that's true. And I found that's a very useful term. Hegemony is a form of domination. But it's a very sneaky form of domination, because it pretends not to dominate. Hegemony is, you know, you first of all, with hegemony, you try you hide the power relationships. And hegemony tries to manufacture consent, which is a famous Chomsky phrase, in which you know, there's a very interesting book that I recommend called The Liberal Way of War, in which, if you think about it, the liberal values we have, even human rights, I mean, who's against human rights, and individualism and freedom and democracy, all contain certain behaviors and values. And in a certain constellation, these are sorts of values and behaviors that make us consumers and that really kind of adapt us to a capitalist sort of economy where we're all participating. And you know, in other words, hegemony makes you behave in certain ways and fit into a system without appearing to dominate, without telling you what to do. In a way, it's kind of hidden. But at the same time, hegemony is a form of domination. And there are hegemons. There are people with power, there's people with agendas, and the governments and corporations and so on, states. And so hegemony can be enforced. So it's, you know, I find that the most useful form of depicting power, because it's very fluid, and it can be very kind and very benign, but at the same time it can pull rank and enforce. And it's much better than power relations, because it's much more subtle and nuanced than just power. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all that, but that's sort of the framework. And then I have, and I'm not going to get into this either right now, I have a whole theory, you know, about hegemony, because what I try to do, it's true, hegemony is a very broad concept, so I try to break it down. And I'm talking about three tasks that the hegemons of the world have. And by hegemons, I mean people who are not people, but sometimes people or parties or governments or corporations or interest groups in different ways, classes that dominate, that in a sense have three tasks. One is to run the entire world system, maintaining overall, and in systems theory, world systems theory, you have an idea of the core. This is the core, you know, the global north, as sometimes we call it. How to keep the core hegemony over the whole system.
Which one is that?
And, pardon me? That's this one here, right here. And you do that by trying to create a consensus. You know, we all are part of the global north, and we're democracies, and the idea that we can identify with the system, but behind it is what the Pentagon calls projecting power. So there's an iron fist behind the nice face of Disneyland. And you manage pacification mainly through precision strikes. There's a whole type of weaponry and tactics emerging that kind of nip resistance in the bud. The second form of hegemony, just not to get into this too much, is maintaining the core hegemony over the semi-peripheries and peripheries of the world system. What we call the third world in a very general, weird kind of a way. It made sense when there were two worlds before that. But, and here is a kind of a custodial hegemony. Development, the whole idea of development as a kind of pacification of people. There's a fellow named Mark Duffield who has written about the development, security, and unending war, where he says development in the third world is really a form of counterinsurgency. It's a form of control. All right, and then there's another task, and that is that the ruling classes within the core, within the global north, keep control of their own societies. And that's where you try to get as much as possible, again, consent, that the powers that be are democratic and they're on our side and we're all participatory and to create that consent. But the point I'm trying to make is that hegemony can also be asserted and it can be enforced. And hegemony can lead to enforced pacification and go back and forth. And that's really what I'm trying to look at. So I'm just going to jump real quick because I don't want to take so much time. But the concept, one of the concepts that first of all, there's concepts in the military world that are very interesting that we should begin to pick up on. The military doesn't talk about battlefields anymore. That's an old concept. Today you talk about battle space because for them, Toronto is as much a battle space, a site of possible resistance or counter-hegemony as much as a battlefield in Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere. So that one of the things that this project is doing of the pacification project is putting together the military's security agencies and police forces. That rather than seeing these as distinct, and rather than seeing them as outside and inside and domestic and foreign and so on, to see them all as an integrated part of a pacification system working in battle space. And therefore war today is taking the form not of war that we're familiar with, but with what a British general called Rupert Smith calls war amongst the people. You don't have any more interstate wars. You don't have World War IIs, even Koreas anymore. What you have are securocratic wars that are basically wars among the people, urban warfare in particular, in which the whole thing isn't only the fighting, but it's how do you securitize? How do you control? How do you nip resistance in the bud? And how do you do it not only in battlefields, but in cities? And not only in the third world, but in the core as well, where you have poor people, you have immigrants, you have working people, you have dissidents, you have all kinds of sources of possible resistance. So the idea of securocratic war cuts across the idea of war. And what the way that I conceive it is that you're talking about full spectrum dominance and control. These are the terms of the Pentagon that translate into military operations, war amongst the people within countries, and framing. I'm not going to get into that. And Israel, I'm just jumping, but Israel, it kind of has a very important place right in the center of this. It's very pivotal. And that's why I took Israel as kind of a focal point, because it reveals a lot about the dynamics of much more than the United States. You know, it doesn't have the power of the US, it doesn't have the economic resources, and so it has to be much more, it has to scramble. It has to be much more strategic, a little country trying to fit in to this huge system, and that reveals more about the system than if you took a big country. And Israel, of course, at any rate, has a very pivotal position. I won't get into all this, but just at a glance, Israel's arms exports are $7 billion a year, roughly. Israel is the 6th or 7th or 8th largest arms exporter. In some, the way it depends on how you count it, but Israel exports more arms at times than Britain or China. Actually, Israel is the #2 arms supplier to China and to India after Russia. Israel produces 18,000 defense commodities. It sells to 190 countries, and there's only 193 countries in the world. So there's a lot of countries that are doing business with Israel that on the surface seem to be enemies, you see. And wait, I'll come back to that. And so the point of security politics is it reveals an alternative logic. You know, Saudi Arabia and Israel would seem to be super enemies, ideologically, religiously, this and you know. But if you introduce weapons and hegemony and control, it turns out that Saudi Arabia and Israel are really allies and very close allies. That's reflected in the fact that it was a Saudi peace initiative in 2002 that really offered Israel to be the regional hegemon. So that you know, in a way, weapons bypass all kinds of ideological differences, political differences, and it creates a whole different logic and a whole different set of international relations. All right, I won't get into all of this and this. These are different kinds of wars: securocratic wars, hybrid wars. I think these are all things that the left has to begin to deal with. You know, for some reason, the military and security is not on our agenda. It's a $1.5 billion business a year with tremendous implications, and we don't really know much about it. And I'm saying that because I don't know much about it. And that's one reason why I found doing this book interesting. So let me just jump in the next 5 minutes and just show you some of the weapon systems that Israel has, but part of the weapon systems, partly just simply to raise our consciousness about the kinds of systems out there, where war is going, so we can begin to plug that into our political agendas. Again, there's the idea of battle space that's kind of everywhere, and integrated battle space. Israel has capacities of launching satellites, for example. There's only 4 or 5 countries in the world that have the capacity to launch satellites, especially a whole system of spy satellites. But Israel's also getting into laser weapons from space that haven't yet become functional, but Israel's at the cutting edge of those kinds of technologies. And they have a whole series of about 10 spy satellites in space, from the Ophik system to Techstar, especially focusing on the Middle East. So we're surveyed 24 hours a day by 1 million different spy systems from space, but Israel is, in the Middle East especially, is one of the most sophisticated. Israel also has interballistic missiles that are with nuclear capabilities. So that Israel has a nuclear capability of going way beyond Iran. As a matter of fact, all of Europe is within Israeli nuclear range, and this is what, you know, Seymour Hersh wrote the book called that Samson option, that Israel has 200 to 300 nuclear warheads and many ways of delivering, and this is sort of their doomsday. If their back is to the wall, they can shoot missiles in all kinds of directions. So this is something that also constrains, I think, people, and not governments and countries when they want to apply pressure to Israel. There's that whole doomsday kind of a capability. Israel's the world's leader probably in UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones that are used both for surveillance, but have been weaponized. And Israel is one of the first countries to weaponize drones. This is the 8-ton drone. This is Elbit's drone, the 450 drone. And what's interesting here is you see, what is that? It's the flag of Brazil. Because these are sold to the Brazilian police, not to the army. In other words, these are types of weapons that span military and police. And you know, in Brazil, because of the World Cup and now the Olympics coming up and so on, Brazil has set up a special police force called the Pacification Police. That's the name that are intended to pacify the favelas in Rio, especially the favelas that are close to the stadiums and the sites of these games. So these are in fact police drones, not only military drones that have to do with urban warfare. But drones aren't just big things. One of where the military is going and where Israel is going, it's one of the leaders of this, is miniaturizing weapons. For example, to create what are called micro air vehicles. You know, to recreate a butterfly, to recreate a bird, and give them the potential both of surveying, reconnaissance. I mean, you could have a little butterfly flying in this room that we wouldn't really notice. That can also be equipped with poisons for what Israel calls targeted killings, but also weaponizing insects. In other words, the weapon systems get so small. Israel is one of the world's leaders in the military applications of nanotechnology. So developing weapons that are of molecular size. All right, Israel has all kinds of missiles from ships, from planes, from the ground. And what you see in their websites, you see combat proven. The Gabriel missile, combat proven ship killer. And they're all combat proven on who? On the Palestinians for the most part, or on on Hezbollah or in the region. So Israel would not have that edge in the market to be able to say this if it didn't have this endemic war that in a sense serves its purposes in many ways. Nuclear submarines. Israel right now has 6 nuclear submarines out of 9 that will be delivered from Germany. So this is one of the submarines being built in Germany, but what's important is these are Israeli submarines. So Israel's responsible for all the high tech that goes into a submarine and some of the weapon systems. So what this does, besides giving Israel submarines, and a couple of the submarines are a gift from the Jewish people from the German people to Israel, which is very nice. But part of it also is that this gives Israel access to German, European, American technologies, which is what, of course, gives Israel an edge in the military market, but also gets into high tech in general. You know, BDS is a very nice idea, but your USB stick is an Israeli invention. And it comes out of them, it's a byproduct of the military. So if we want to go all the way, we should throw away our USB sticks. The point I'm trying to make is that these aren't only weapon systems that are standalone, but they give Israel a tremendous ability to develop the most high-tech weapon systems. And that's what Israel specializes in. It doesn't build major platforms. It doesn't build F-35s and ships and small ships, but not large. You know, it can't do things that are too big. But they specialize especially in components like the Lightning targeting pod that helps jets target. And there's almost no air force in the world that doesn't use the Lightning pod of Israel. All kinds of missile systems, anti-missile systems, like the Iron Dome system. There is a tank that Israel makes, the Merkava tank, which is one of the most sophisticated tanks. But what's interesting is there's an offshoot that's called the Merkava 4 LIC. It's a combination of a tank and an armored personnel carrier. But you know what LIC stands for? Low intensity conflict. This is urban warfare. Whether it's in Gaza or whether it's in cities anywhere, including, and these are types of military equipment that are being sold to police forces. In the United States, this is a huge issue. But these are types of weapon systems, again, that are spanning the military and homeland security. All right, protection systems. Israel has a huge simulation base in the Negev Desert that's Arab. There's an urban area, there's a village area, all kinds of Arab environments where American and Canadian and other troops and Israeli troops come to train before they go to Iraq or Afghanistan or other places. All right, I won't get into cyber warfare. Israel is one of the world's leaders in cyber warfare. For example, the worms that attack the Iranian. I mean, the attack of the Stuxnet worm a few years ago in Iran is considered the first battle first battle of cyber war, of a whole cyber war, a new kind of war that's developing. And the cutting edge, and we have to be aware of all these things. And I'm saying this because I think most of us come from the social sciences. You know, social sciences, humanities. We don't know science very much. You know, E.P. Snow wrote his book, The Two Cultures, in the 50s, where we don't really know science. What these people are cooking up in their labs. So sometimes when I'm talking, it sounds like science fiction. But in fact, these are things, the cutting edge, and it's military. Because that's where the billions of dollars go in terms of high-tech development, much more than through corporations. So the civilian applications that we finally get, or the biomedical applications of nanotechnology, are simply the byproducts. But the actual development has come through the military. One of the departments of the Pentagon is called DARPA. D-A-R-P-A. It's a small department. It only has a $4 billion a year budget. And its job is to make science fiction real. That's its mission. They take Tom Cruise movies, they take Harry Potter movies, all the science fiction stuff, and translate it into actual military equipment. For example, DARPA has developed a cloak that makes a soldier or a tank invisible. It's not quite operational, but it's getting very close. And it does it through nano mirrors that reflect light in certain ways that can actually render a tank invisible. So things that we really think of as science fiction, flying broomsticks and things like that, are actually things that are beginning to be operational. In fact, the cutting edge of military is called GNR, Genetics, Nanotechnology, and Robotics. Putting these things together. And even in terms of enhancing soldiers in that way. So there's all kinds of robotic soldiers like this. Firing machine that guards the border of Gaza. So you don't need soldiers. These are another, what are called spy and shoot towers around Gaza. So when you hear about 5 Gazan farmers that were shot, they weren't shot by soldiers there. They were shot by women soldiers mainly, sitting in a control booth in Tel Aviv that run these automatic remote weapon stations. All right, I won't go into all of this, but this certainly gets into the police forces as well. The militarization of the police. And people have written about the Israelification of the police forces of the world, especially SWAT teams. All kinds of Israeli weapons. For example, corner shot is an Israeli weapon, you see, where soldiers or policemen can shoot around corners. And they're not exposed to to fire. The use of all kinds of robots, nano needles, all kinds of nanotechnologies for that. And of course, nanotechnology also affects the DNA of populations. It's kind of a biological warfare against you can make an entire population forget through spraying with nano substances. There's a development of what's called smart dust. If you want to find somebody like Bin Laden, let's say you want to find somebody in Gaza or anywhere, Toronto, you can spray with a dust, like a crop duster coming over and spraying a city. But the dust, which really is the size of dust, that's almost undetectable, are in fact sensors. And you can program in someone's DNA, or a number of people's DNA, and the sensors will find that person in a whole urban area. You can even program sensors to kill people. So that nanotechnology is a kind of a weaponry that we're not really that aware of. And finally, I'll end on this, I guess. Another niche of Israel, and Israel's niche filling, is also what's called lawfare. And that is trying to attack international law and human rights in a way that makes it possible for states to attack civilians. If you know, with the ICC, the Palestinians going to the International Criminal Court, Israel has called for a dismantling of the criminal court, no less. But Israel has also has a campaign of lawfare that's trying, for example, one of the rules of law, one of the laws is you don't attack non-combatants, civilians. Israel says, well, but that ties our hand behind our back when we're fighting terrorists. In Gaza, we want to kill everybody, because who knows who a terrorist is. The whole idea of any resistance is terrorism, and any terrorist should be a fair target. And so international law, from Israel's point of view, in fact, serves the terrorists, because it ties the hands of democracies that can't attack terrorists because of human rights. So we have to change international law. It's a very sophisticated system, but it's very powerful. Here, for example, after the assault on Gaza in 2008 and 2009, the Chinese spokesperson came to Israel to learn how the IDF framed and sold the Gaza operation. You know, if Israel can assault Gaza the way it does and still sell itself to Canada as the only democracy in the Middle East, wow, imagine what China could do with Tibet or with its Muslim population in the West. So that this framing and changing of international law has become very important. So I'm going to end on that, but I just wanted to, I know it wasn't very systematic, but just to kind of lay out in a few minutes some of the issues, some of the technologies, some of these concerns that I think we have to start bringing much more into the agenda of the left. So thanks.
I want to speak just slightly on a different note, and then to come to Canada to speak a little bit on the political economic context by which these developments are forming. And I think it's one of those moments where it's important for the left to take calibration of the political forces and not just the military forces that Jeff has been speaking about, given what has been happening on the political right. This is partly from the breakthrough of the political parties of the hard right in Europe, the election of the BJP in India, the continuing strength of the far right in the U.S. Republican Party, of course, the Conservative Party in Canada, the hard right forces in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Ukraine, Putin in Russia, and clearly what Jeff has been speaking about, the militarization and intensification of right-wing forces in Israel and Palestine. So I think it's important to gain some consideration or some thinking about those political forces and the political economic moment that we're in. When we think about the the economic conjuncture, we are in the sixth year, seventh year of the economic crisis since 2008. The stage that has followed the emergency exit strategies of 2011, 2012. We're in a stage where there's very slow growth in the world market, particularly in the core economies. Japan and Germany still remain in relatively deflationary conditions, as does the wider European Union. The BRICS are struggling, including China's growth rate still has been half since what it was before the crisis, is still sliding. The only slight shift has been in the US, but the US growth rates remain relatively slow and are largely predicted to be stagnant in a period of relatively long depression as well. So we're in a very long period of austerity and turmoil in the world market, and the crisis hasn't been reversed. What's been striking about this, though, at the same time, is that the power structures and forms of development that occurred before the crisis have largely been reinforced. That is, some of the issues of the power block or the structures of political hegemony, to use that word again, that Jeff was speaking about, have been reinforced. There's been no splintering of the power block or power structures in most countries, or any countries in a significant way. The dynamics of wage and social austerity that existed before the crisis have been reinforced. We're in a period of longer term or deepening the inequalities within states and between states. The states have been responding with a range of additional privatization, deregulation measures. The US was the economically dominant power before the crisis. If anything, the crisis has reinforced the US's position at the center of the world market, and particularly leading a lot of the global pacification and war-making strategies that Jeff was laying out. This remains a key component of the world market, or the key component of the world market. The social democratic left nowhere in the world is offering a political challenge to the movement of the political right. They've largely been accommodating it. We're not seeing a social democracy tacking to the left at this moment. Maybe there will be some breakthroughs with the Syriza election, the Greece election with Syriza, but somewhat outside social democracy. But that's the condition we're in. With the squeezing out of alternatives that was there before the crisis, if anything, being intensified. I think when we look then at the power structures inside the state, Jeff didn't speak to that directly, but it is a deepening of the neoliberal form of the state that has been apparent for some long period. I think it's important to think about the way that the general reorganization of the state has taken place. One of these is, of course, a strengthening of the central economic apparatuses implementing austerity. That is, the departments of finances, and often this has occurred through special arms of the state being formed that have focused on the restructuring and the deliverance of austerity, insulating it from the democratic forms in parliament and so on. Crucially and surprisingly, compared to other crises, the parts of the state that deal with the internationalization of capital and the protection of international property rights have been strengthened, not weakened. They have, the deepening of those efforts towards foreign investment protection agreements, FIPAs, the various expansion of other trade agreements and so forth. The social apparatuses of the state are not only decreasing in the amounts of spending that is being transferred to health, education, and welfare, but also adopting in their administrative practices forms of pacification. They're directed at the particular way that the poor are being policed in more intense ways, but this is an integral part of the way that the health, education, and welfare apparatuses have been restructured. There's been a relative isolation of the limited democracy that exists in capitalist democracies through the marginalization of legislative assemblies. There's been the intensification of the marketization and commercialization of the state, an attempt to kind of monetize everything you can to try and increase the role of the private sector and market. And then especially where the state has been strengthened, it is in the security, policing, all kinds of policing, the prison systems, you know, all the monitoring systems, all those parts of the state have been systematically strengthened. Some of their budgets have been slightly lowered, but when you're reading about the cutbacks or the complaints of police budgets being cut, you've got to remember that this was after how radically they were increased after 2001. So they're coming back from relative high points and are being cut a lot less than anything else. So I think what we're seeing is not just a specific phase in neoliberalism or in the crisis, but a particular way that the state is being restructured at this moment, particularly what we often can see as a hardening or militarization of the state along the lines that Jeff was speaking about. And it's not far off to speak about an authoritarian phase of neoliberalism forming, where parliaments are relatively marginal and the policing and security apparatuses are being strengthened. This is not just a short-term phenomenon, which is one of the things that we have to get our heads around. It's not just a short-term phenomenon. At the beginning of the crisis, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, and all these state apparatuses that deal with the production of international coordination and hegemony, we're saying that we were into 25 to 30 years of austerity. And they have then been, these core states have been moving in this direction of austerity. They have moved through the G20 process and a range of other mechanisms of committing to, for example, a 20% cut in labor market regulations, a 20% cut in product market regulation. And they've made about 400, this is concrete commitments that they're monitoring the execution of in terms of all those facets of neoliberalism across the entire state structure. They have also, alongside this, a total privatization project being driven by KPMG, Deloitte, and so on, a bunch of the international consulting agencies, but being coordinated by the OECD, who's running this governance project that deals with and coordinates with the government to take a list of every piece of public asset they have and figure a way to privatize or monetize it. This is the parallel which is going on inside the restructuring of the state as a whole that is parallel to what's happening with the military and security apparatuses. Last year, a paper was put forward by the OECD that has been widely discussed and is being part of kind of the way that the central states are reorganizing their public policies. It is called Policy Challenges for the Next 50 Years. And that's basically a strategy for 50 years more of the intensification of neoliberalism and privatization. So this is a really long-term project that they have that parallels the overall structure of the state, the hardening of the state, the shift to the political right, and the kind of restructuring of the military apparatuses that Jeff was speaking about. In Canada, we have done a lot of restructuring of our international and foreign policy apparatuses consistent with this. This, of course, dates back to the initial Chrétien-Martin government and the way they began repositioning the Canadian overall policy matrix at the national level, including foreign policy in the mid-1990s, and was intensified after 2001. And there was a number of components to this. Of course, the core component was, after 2001, forming the explicit project of Homeland Defense, using the American words, and Fortress North America, which of course combined a particular strong nativism with an aggressive imperialism, and attempted to kind of mimic everything that the Americans were doing around domestic security inside the Canadian state and coordinate it with them. Secondly, of course, was the redesign of all the security capacities of the Canadian state. That was especially seen by the reforming of, or forming at the national level, the Ministry of Public Safety, a new committee that deals with that on security matters, and the reorienting of all the branches of the Canadian state so they dealt with security. So if you have a policy now and you're going forward in the Canadian government, even if it's dealing with heritage issues, you have to, when you're putting the proposal forward through cabinet, through cabinet discussions and so forth, you have to make sure it passes all these security tests. You know, it doesn't matter what it is, that's the structure inside the Canadian state now that deals with the generalization of the security focus and the pacification focus that Jeff was speaking about. Another component of this, of course, was the reorientation of Canadian foreign policy in the international policy statement from the mid-2000s. What dealt with the way that Canada restructured border security and aligned itself with economic concerns with the U.S., particularly around the Smart Borders Initiative, all the developments that have occurred around border security, the increasing coordination, and every Canadian department now has a twin with the U.S., particularly not only about policy matters, but linking around security issues. So it doesn't matter what department it is, it'll have a corresponding link and a security kind of link with the American agency in that area. Thirdly, of course, was the way that the Canadian military was restructured. This occurred in the initial phase after 2001 under the Chrétien-Martin government. It had been started to shift in this direction in the mid-1990s, but it was a movement towards network joint capabilities, the capacity of the Canadian state to deploy in what they referred to as multi-force, multi-country actions. It involved a complete overhaul of military hardware. It involved a retraining of the Canadian, all the Canadian troops, and so on to deal with its capacity to intervene militarily. This, you know, is a form. Jeff didn't use these terms, but it's a variation of the way Jeff was speaking about military action shifting. And essentially in Canada, this is a strategy of participating in disciplinary militarism. That is, the disciplining states that are kind of broken from whatever IMF or U.S. foreign policy in particular ways, and disciplining them back, and then undertaking a lot of kind of the guerrilla warfare techniques that have been so important to these pacification strategies. The fourth component was, of course, the additional protection for the internationalization of capital. This was, of course, the reintegration of CETA inside foreign affairs. The way that Canada has pursued and has been the leading country in the world in pursuing international trade agreements, and particularly the foreign investment protection agencies to protect foreign capital invested abroad. You know, this has been the way that Canada has moved, particularly to protect the mining industry. We have about 40 or so, it depends how you count them and what are still in different stages of negotiation. We have somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 free trade agreements now signed, or foreign investment protection agencies, and we're kind of increasing the numbers of those all the time. There's an incredible catalog that we can list. I'm going to just partly do it just to kind of show you how much the Canadian state has been reorganized for these new political economic conditions, and for kind of the pacification kind of strategies that Jeff was talking about. I don't even have to go back to 2001, but just since the last few years of the Harper government. In terms of Fortress North America, we coordinated with the U.S. Homeland Security Department and Public Safety Canada in what is now a regular process of joint threat assessments. We, in 2011, we added and developed the Beyond the Border Action Plan to enhance security, cooperation, and trade around border issues. We had developed a further kind of strategy with the U.S. called Beyond the Border, dealing with perimeter security and economic cooperation. We've added a new regulatory structure called the Regulatory Cooperation Council to deepen the integration with the U.S. and to deal with different aspects of cooperation. We've added the various anti-terrorism acts that have given increased power to CSIS, the Canadian CSEC, and the Canadian Border Services. This includes, of course, the anti-terrorism legislation that was to be from 2001 that was to go into end, and of course we renewed it in 2013, and now we have another new bill of anti-terrorism legislation that's going before Parliament now. and so on. In terms of free trade and all those dimensions, as I mentioned, we've been expanding the number of free trade agreements everywhere. This includes all kinds of additional efforts in the way that the Department of Foreign Affairs has been reorganized to strengthen strengthen the internationalization of Canadian capital, especially banks and mining capital, with a whole range of free trade agreements. We've been expanding the range of multilateral negotiations and or rejecting multilateral negotiations and expanding foreign intervention in all kinds of areas. This, of course, is the notorious rejection of cooperation around climate change that Canada has been engaged in, systematically being even more than the U.S. being against international cooperation in that area. Our continued involvement in Haiti, particularly in security and policing matters, our continued involvement in Israel and Palestine, and where Canada supports those activities is particularly in Palestine. That's what Canadian foreign aid is mainly, is about the strengthening of the policing forces in Palestine. The support we gave to the coup in Honduras. Of course, the deployment in a forward position of Canadian combat planes and troops in the Ukraine, and we were the most vociferous state in backing the Ukrainian government. The support in terms of military strategy, we have adopted as part of our military doctrines the same thing as the U.S. in terms of strategy of we're being engaged in perpetual war, which is the terminology that is used by the Canadian Defence Forces, supplement to the Canada First Defence Strategy. We have the continuing support and military commitments in Afghanistan across the Middle East. We have obviously the deployment of the troops over the last number of months in Iraq against ISIS, which of course not a non-combat route, but I think we've supplied now something like 600 to 800 refueling operations of the other bombers jets. We've undertaken, I think, somewhere in the order of 300 missions ourselves, and I think we've struck 50 or 60 times, but that's not combat. So, the deepening of this is across the board. As well, we continue to develop and deploy the Joint Task Force troops, the Special Operations Regiment, and so on and so forth. So systematically, we see the Canadian state moving in this direction. Finally, on diplomacy in relationship to these issues. Of course, Canada now is the most right-wing supporter of Israel in the United Nations and the way that we've moved our diplomatic votes and so on. This, of course, is the example that Judy mentioned in terms of not wanting Israel brought in terms of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and a whole range of those votes that any kind of vote dealing with Israel, Canada has moved itself from the abstention position to the no position in support of Israel, and so on. This is, in Canada, and in terms of the wider political economic context, a difficult period. And it requires us to not only think about what we can do to deal with the pacification direction that deals with everything from domestic policing and domestic security to the way it's deployed in international military forces. It means that we have to really be rethinking our strategies around demonstrations, our strategy for coordination for developing political capacities, and the way that we develop a specific agenda to try to shift things in Canada in terms of these issues. It's hard to deal with Canadian foreign policy in the way that the Middle East has been a crucial testing point for Canadian foreign policy in the reorganization. I think this means that the politics towards Palestine and the politics towards the Middle East have to be at a central component of an oppositional position in Canada on foreign policy. We need a reversal of those positions, and we need to be doing everything we can to develop that capacity. It's also, I think, in the peace movement, not only kind of making, not only dealing with those issues in the Middle East, but moving on withdrawal of troops, which remains a crucial issue in terms of both the Ukraine and the Middle East. We need to address the attempt to develop and stop the Canadian government attempt to develop 5 or 6 permanent foreign bases for intervention. Essentially, there is one permanent base that has moved in that direction, and that is Kuwait, which is where the Canadian troops are being deployed. With now, it's not officially a permanent base, but that's more or less what it is now. I think those things have to be central to what we're doing. And of course, the final thing that I think is important in Canada is the NDP's move away from positions of withdrawal from NATO and NORAD as kind of principled positions that they have historically had and have moved away from in the last decade. And this remains, if we can't win that kind of principled position there, it's going to be hard for us to win those other things. I think those are fundamental components of an alternative direction around foreign policy we need in Canada. Thank you.
I'm just going to try to say that there's really, I think you can put them in 3 sort of categories. I mean, the first thing is, of course, the global transformations in the institutions and even in societies that we recognize, government/state, you know, capitalism, markets, actors, all the kind of this society, state society we call something like Canada or Israel or the United States or Germany. And this, the question, of course, is these transformations may, you know, we have to ask the question, are they part of a broader, longer historical trajectory? Are we watching a real shift in the making, and so on? I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing, second issue, again, the question of Israel, okay, which Jeff focused on, and is a piece of this. It's an important piece. I mean, it's kind of Israel out into the world, but it is the question of whether and how its sort of military industries, what I also call sort of hyper-security practices and so on, can be understood. How we think and evaluate those. Do we evaluate them against the actual social context of Palestine and Israel? Do we evaluate them against the questions of, you know, new practices and transformations and so on? And I'll come back to that in a second. And then, of course, a very important thing, you know, which is kind of Judy sort of started off with the question of change. What is to be done, so to speak? Where do we go from here in thinking about these? And, you know, how do we do that? And that's a sort of third issue, which I see that, you know, I could add many more, but I think those 3 things kind of in a way, for me at least, encapsulate some of the stakes here. Now, of course, the first 2 points are very related. I almost hinted at that already. Israel exceptional, I mean, to some degree, given its history, identity, location in the world? Is it part of the global transformation? You know, kind of what one way we could take an implication of what Greg is saying is that, you know, Canada's along the way too, and all kind of things. And the other implication of the fact that the export of practices around militarization, various forms of intense police action, as well as new forms of surveillance and forms of violence and so on, technologically based, that every state is involved in it. And the question then becomes whether there's something particular in evaluating Israel's role that makes it sort of different. It makes it something we have to judge differently than we would judge, let's say, our own state, our country, Canada here. So that's a very, something to put on the table, because that relates then to the third question of what is to be done, clearly, because, right, I mean, how do we evaluate this? There's a lot of information. How do we start thinking in political terms about it, which is what partly when we say, at least I do, what is to be done, how do we get beyond, what is the alternatives? We all want to do that. So, you know, and clearly we need to understand all the processes, we need to understand the facts and so on. Very important, as Judy said, but we have to do something with them. We have to start formulating thinking around them, and not just forms of analysis, but also, I think, forms of how it should be otherwise. Now, I'll just go back thinking for a minute about that, coming back to that point about the New Zealand example, right? I mean, I'm at Jeff's point, I'm not convinced of that argument because, and I know he isn't either. I know he said that as a sort of play to, as a rhetorical flourish so that, would, make this point. Whether he really, and I'd be interested to find out how much he really thinks that the lab point is really there. But, New Zealand is, some of you know the history of New Zealand. New Zealand has a horrible indigenous history in terms of its exploitation. So I guess there's not much population compared to, let's say, even Australia, but that history is continued into the present, very problematic. And that raises, when we come back to what is to be done in the transformation of the state is, there's implicit in a lot of all this, which just came out in the New Zealand example, is all we have to do is, in a sense, is get rid of the bad stuff, remove what's negative, and suddenly, it could be better, it should be better, okay? And I deal with this, in fact, with my students and all, I try to push. I know it's a very difficult thing. I'm talking about, let's say, the graduate students, going for PhDs, MAs, and stuff. And I always say, a lot of criticism and critique, say this is bad, wrongs here, wrongs there. There's the implied kind of political position which says remove the wrongs and things will be better. Okay, that's the kind of position. And in fact, I personally, and this is maybe something for discussion or at least to think about, that in fact I don't believe that's the case. I think that you could go all the way down and quite far down removing the wrongs, and what lies underneath it is maybe the wrongs of the political institutions that we actually face. Okay, and thus it's not by coincidence that all of these are states that are in play. The establishment of the State of Israel is the establishment of a state, and there's a long history. This relationship between militarization and industry and all kind of and society has gone on for a very long time. And there was an historian, William H. McNeill, wrote a book a long time ago, The Pursuit of Power, and he actually, some of you may be familiar with it. It's a wonderful book. It goes back to about the 11th, 12th century, and he shows this dynamic, the relationship between, in fact, merchants, even farmers, aristocrats, and development of weaponry, and back and forth as a mutual relationship that's totally been co-constituted. We're talking, at this point, he's actually looking at 800 years of history. Now we're totally enthralled by the technologies, and they seem unbelievable, but when we, put them into context, destruction is destruction. We know there's a horrible history of the application of technology. So that becomes a question that stands out. If we're really serious about the question of change, we have to ask ourselves that. I mean, what would it mean to actually create the conditions where, in fact, this sort of thing is less possible, that we actually would be organized in different ways? I think that becomes a really important question. Now, that does rely on understanding the circumstances, well, the analysis. I mean, we will put up this notion of a world systems theory, something I'm very familiar with and spent long times thinking about ages ago and stuff like that. And there's different points in history. I won't go into all the details. I know you didn't because there's only so much time. But it goes back to the first point. Are we in a transformation? If our states, if our corporations, all our institutional actors are in the middle of a transformation into something new, are we just looking to ameliorate those things or not? As a question, because most of what's taken place, you mentioned kind of liberalism and so on, all the development of human rights, all the Enlightenment emergence of things have all taken place at the same time as the greatest forms of destruction have emerged. Okay, they're simultaneous. I don't think it's by mistake. I won't go into it, or just by happenstance. They go together, unfortunately. So that's a really hard thing to accept. Okay, that in fact, when we grant, now you mentioned the example of development. going along with, with militarization. This is going on for a very long time. I mean, history of colonialism, right? Civilizing mission and so on. Motivate incredibly well-motivated people. The path to hell, paved with good intentions. All of those well-intentions exactly played around because, in fact, the question is there any really out from these forms of power and violence and all that? I mean, we have to actually face that question. I'm actually putting something, I know it's a kind of difficult issue, but how do we then evaluate? I mean, what does it mean to evaluate what Israel is doing in terms of its participation? Again, either we say, okay, it's just one of, it's got its particular history, it's just part of the global system anyway, and Canada's doing it, gee, we're doing it in our little, more minor way, but hey, wouldn't we love to sell this one, this thing, that thing? We always brag about the arm on the, NASA thing and so on. We have there's absolutely we're involved and have been involved with the F-35. It's, if they're all doing this, right, we have to really ask the question of what would it mean to stop that. Now, the problem is it doesn't mean just capturing, changing governments. I mean, this has been the great betrayal for many people in the States, right? Obama, again, like I said, it goes together. Obama gets elected on this kind of progress agenda and so on. And what does he do? Greatest deportations, greatest militarization, all sorts of new wars and drones in the levels that have never been seen, okay? So progressive politics, the left hasn't come to terms with this problem. It has, because I think it still has a sort of hope that if we can just remove the conditions, if we could just change the central actors, that we will overcome these problems. We will overcome the absence of violence and power and so on. So I wanted maybe to, I know this is a heavy thing, but the question is if we evaluate this, and I'll kind of stop here, because I know there's, and in fact, I could go on for a long time on this thing and I won't do that. But, I think the question is, if we're really serious, I don't think we can just know all the conditions and the weapon systems and the bad practices. Okay, I think we need to start thinking of a left. It starts to offer serious self-reflection on this. That it's reflex answers. Let's create, a democratic socialist society. Let's get rid of, neoliberalism. Let's, get rid of the police and let's go for community policing. Even though I know that's even a bad word these days among my criminalization colleagues. That's been used by NATO and so on. That somehow, if we were to do all those things, we would end up in a good place. If we're not in a good place, we will. It's because of the world, all the manipulations and the world systems of power. It's not completely clear. And I'll just end there to say that how do we evaluate these institutions? I mean, how can we really start a really serious question? This is where thinking, going back to Jeff's original points about the relationship between people that are activists and involved in praxis, and then people who are involved in thinking and who can, who have the ability to marshal a history of thought, because there's a lot of reinvention of the wheel. That the state has been reinventing itself around the relationship between violence and technology and commerce and population control, right? It's been doing it for 800 years, okay? Why would it stop even if it becomes, this or that political hue, left or right, whatever? I'm less convinced, I'm convinced that it's the structure of the thing itself, that we have to actually change the nature of that itself. So, that in that case, I would, even if we're not, I'm not necessarily advocating, I'm not saying, it's not a question of anarchism versus this and so on, the black flag, the red flag, it's not about that, okay? So it's about actually being serious about it, we've had this long 20th century, and, we know the origins, look at some of the origins, even within Israel, the progressive Zionist origins and so on, which became so deeply corrupted, right? There's so many things, American origins, French origins, all the revolutionary, right? Look at Soviet Union, we can go through over and over again this history. We're not serious about evaluating that history. So that's how I think we have to apply that kind of lens to actually evaluate those three conditions. Anyway, I'll stop there.
But we don't have, and that's one of the things I've been trying to push to have. We don't have a place like this. I mean, this is wonderful with Robert and Beit Zaytun, and I mean, you guys. We don't have this in Israel anywhere. There used to be a place that was called Safta, but that's been gone for years and years and years. We tried to set up an ICANN, a place called Daila, which was like this, but it didn't work, and the different groups wouldn't come together. And so, I don't know if we're unusual or you're unusual, but I certainly find that these kinds of evenings and this level of discussion around these issues is something that really doesn't happen very often, at least in our activist community. And that's why I really appreciate this opportunity. Judy was mentioning different kinds of structures, and what I'd like to relate to, because I think also Greg and Robert were talking about, the problems of looking at the structures, the world system, the states as we've known it, the restructuring idea, neoliberalism and how it's restructuring. And it's true, we should really begin to think about new kinds of structures emerging, and maybe the categories we're using, certainly states and so on, are shifting. That's why I like the idea of hegemony, because it's very fluid. And maybe we don't have such a fluid concept in terms of the structures we're talking about. But there's one other, well, there's a lot of others, but there's one other component here that I think is really interesting, and that's human agency. The whole issue of agency. And I think here, I think the essence of what we are on the left in the activist movement is we have agency. We can be counter-hegemonic, anti-systemic, we can be in opposition, we have a new agenda, we can change agendas, we're activists. The whole idea of activist and changing implies agendas. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to warn about, we like to think that human agency is undefeatable. And we kind of say, well, all right, you have all these high-tech things, but the Al-Qaeda with their low-tech technology, look, they completely defeated the United States. Or look at Hamas, even in Gaza. Israel did not, with all the high-tech stuff it has and the power, it didn't get very far into Gaza. And it didn't achieve its aims, which was to at least weaken Hamas enough that the Palestinian Authority could take over Gaza. So, we shouldn't overestimate, and I think there's a tendency to minimize some of the forces that we're against. Because in my, I don't know, maybe I'm completely over, because I don't know the military very well. I'm writing a book about something I know nothing about, which is interesting, and it's important because I'm bringing questions, and I think I represent a lot of us in that we don't really, I think a lot of commentators obviously talk about militarism. We all talk about militarism in the world and all that, but we don't know much about it. Part of what I was trying to do was to ask, how is it really done? That's why I wanted to get into what are the new weapon systems? How is it really done? Not just that there is militarism, that there is force, but how is it really, how are they doing it? Because we don't know this, I don't know this stuff. And part of it has to do with agency, because I think the danger that I see is that technology, military technology, and securocratic, surveillance and monitoring and intelligence and so on, is getting to a place where I think it really is endangering human agency. In other words, we could be getting to a place where there is very little space left for us. One of the systems that Israel has, one of the projects that a lot of its companies and all of its security companies, it has 23 security surveillance companies that are on the NASDAQ stock exchange. I mean, huge corporations all over the world. And one of the systems is called NICE, Systems. How's that for branding? Nice Systems, that has a whole project that's called Safe Cities. And the whole idea of Safe Cities is to integrate all the forms of monitoring and control and information gathering, to monitor all your phone calls, your chatting, your social media, your emailing, cameras all over, and not just cameras, but to collect data on everyone, so that you have video cameras, and NICE has these cameras installed in Safe Cities programs that do facial recognition. Of course, there's 600 checkpoints in Israel. So Israel's one of the world's leaders in biometrics. You know, you've got millions of Palestinians going through checkpoints all. It's a perfect place for nice systems that comes out of the military. There's a whole unit called 8200 that is one of the most sophisticated. It's like the NSA in the United States. And these security companies come out of these units in the army with the Palestinian guinea pigs and develop. So these cameras of nice systems do face recognition, body recognition, bionic recognition, recognition of clothing, recognition of the way you walk. I mean, there's a million types of parameters. And it puts it into the system so that, and it follows patterns. So if you're picked up, the police want to find you, they can find you, they can recognize, or they see a figure they want to pick up. They can recognize that figure almost instantly as you. They can plot instantaneously. They don't want to have to see hours and hours of films. It's all digitalized. They can tell where you were over the last 6 months. They can plot your movements.
Ow.
And I won't get into all the details, but they can also plot where you're going. So in other words, the security people can know where you're ending up before you know where you're going. I mean, so what I'm saying is the systems are getting to a point where I think they're threatening human agency in general. And one of the questions is, could we get to a point in which we might have our analyses and we might know what's going on, but we have no power to change it because these systems are so totalized. And then you go one step further, and people are talking about this in terms of artificial intelligence. You know, one of the problems of robots, introducing robots into warfare, is that robots have to respond instantly. A human being can't run a robot. You have to respond much more quickly than a human being can in a war situation as a robot, and the robot has to learn. You can't program. You don't know what's going to happen. It's all unpredictable. So you have enhanced artificial intelligence, where robots start to learn from each other. They learn from experience, like we do, and of course, it's one of the popular themes in films. But I think it's really a possibility that's coming out of the military, and that is robots that will simply destroy our agency and be smarter than us, that will co-opt us, that will control and so on. So I think that's another kind of part of the, it's not institutionalized, it's another kind of an agency. And how do we protect our human agency on the one hand, and on the other hand, how do we use our agency to try to fight this? And this takes a real strategy that I think we're really, so I think we're so far from understanding what we're up against and what's going on in this science fiction world of the military that's really coming into being, that we're not able to develop strategies of defending our agency and affecting the world system. So I think that's another aspect of this whole militarization that we should be talking about. So in a different way, I'm responding to this issue of alternatives to institutions and alternative form. I think we should really look at human agency as a key when we're planning our strategizing our oppositional movements.
So I think, again, people can look at the film from last night, but I was thinking about your looking at different kinds of communities actually, that can be represented, that can work together. And you were talking about two different kinds of parliaments, dealing with issues of individuals, but also communities based on a whole bunch of different kinds of mutual interests, including a community of children, which I thought was very interesting.
Right.
Anyway, so.
Okay, let others ask questions.
Yeah.
Bob and I can come after.
I can just
There's
respond.
probably other people asking.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just responding just really quickly to this point, but one thing is, however much state capital organizes, there is counter-organization. It always has been historically. Okay, for every system, there's a workaround. There are ways of deflecting from it, and including the long, horrible history of colonialism and so on. And when they're actually talking about film, this is brilliantly illustrated in the Battle of Algiers, for example, right? We've seen, French used every possible technique of network sort of, quote, terror and so on. And they didn't realize the political ground was shifting from under them. And once the entire society got mobilized, there's new forms of agency in terms of the resistance that didn't exist 10 or 15 years. So for every technology that's used to contain, to surveil, there's ways of constructing other forms of resistance agency. I do believe that. I mean, it is confrontation. It's a battle. There's no question about it, and there are losses, and but that I don't think we should feel completely pessimistic in that way that it's Big Brother. That's what Big Brother wants you to believe, right? That you can't fight City Hall. That's what City Hall says. I mean, nonsense. We absolutely can. And there's incredible creativity out there, and from the other side of it. But we can't be, quixotic about it either, right? It's not, it's not a panacea. It's just, right? It's something that is, a constant struggle, and that's all we have, struggle.